Disobedience. I'm chairing this week because Tamsin's a bit under the weather. I hope I can do a good a job of chairing as she does. And when Nikki's finished, after about 20 minutes, there'll be a chance for lots of questions and discussion. So please don't feel shy that you have to know every last dot and comma about Martin Luther King. We want the discussion is the most important thing. So if I could ask Nikki to make a start on Martin Luther King, non-violence and civil disobedience.
Nikki, you're still muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Fantastic. All right, I'll start again. So yeah, so that was the title that was given, but it's kind of just a rebel's guide to Martin Luther King. So, but it's all still about Martin Luther King, so I'm sure we'll be fine. So anyway, today I think we'd probably all agree, I hope we'd all agree that we're in a really exciting and almost unprecedented situation in terms of what's happening with the protests and the movement and the interest in really trying to get rid of racism. After the horrific murder of George Floyd on the 25th of April by 4 Minneapolis police officers in broad daylight with many witnessing, the US and quickly much of the world rose up in anger at this abhorrent and sadly commonplace act to say no more. Everything Martin Luther King believed was rotten about the US in the 50s and 60s is still clearly in evidence all around us today. But although most would accept that Martin Luther King struggled and ultimately was assassinated for fighting racism, many people believe that as socialists we have more to learn from the seemingly much more radical and uncompromising politics of Malcolm X or Angela Davis. That's why I think it's really brilliant that we're having this meeting, because the lessons from the struggles of the 60s are vital for radicals and activists and revolutionaries fighting now. And Martin Luther King was in the forefront of leading the strategies and tactics of that pretty amazing and world-changing movement, the civil rights movement. But although, like many great leaders that the establishment can't corrupt or destroy, they try to distort their legacy and reduce it to cooperating with the same rulers that divide and degrade us. And they do try and divide us, don't they? They play us off against each other. And believe it or not, in 2018, on the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination, none other than our everyone's friend, Donald Trump, I'm joking obviously, said of Martin Luther King, "A man I have studied, watched and admired my entire life." So yeah, put your teeth back in, stop laughing. That's what he said. That's what they try and do. I can't imagine they'd have been sitting, they'd been standing arm in arm on a demonstration when Martin Luther King was alive. Many radicals dismiss King as a liberal who went cap in hand to the establishment to beg for reforms and merely tinker with the system, whilst holding Malcolm X up as the leader that the civil rights movement really needed. Both these views of the famous leader are at least misplaced, but essentially an insult to this brave and principled campaigner. King, as I will outline in my talk, was someone who was in his lifetime vilified by the likes of J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI, and hounded as a subversive almost to the point of suicide. The pressure on the man, if you read biographies, it's truly horrific. What Jeremy Corbyn put up with was nothing compared to what Martin Luther King had to put up with. It was horrific. And he became more radical as the movement progressed, finally becoming a passionate and powerful critic of capitalism and its dependence on racism and war to survive. So now I just really want to look at, I think it's quite important to see where Martin Luther King started, because that's what it's all about, and where he got to at the end, because like a lot of us, our politics change through our experience and through age. So he was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1929. Martin Luther King Jr. was the son of a preacher. He was an extremely bright student and graduated from university at just 19, at which point he decided to become a minister. At only 25, he became a pastor of a church in Montgomery, Alabama. Montgomery is seen as the birthplace of the civil rights movement because of the famous year-long bus boycott that started in 1955. The The civil rights movement would involve hundreds of thousands of people, both black and white, from across the country. Together they marched, they sat in, they occupied, they sat down, and they were beaten, bombed and killed for daring to resist racism and inequality. So how did this situation develop in the so-called cradle of democracy? Well, after World War II, the country that had fought fascism and imposed the European empires that supported colonial struggles treated their returning black soldiers in the South in the same despicable way they had before they left. But there was a difference. The soldiers had changed. The legally enforced segregation they had suffered since the 1880s was as entrenched as ever. It distorted every aspect of people's lives. It's hard to think about it now, but it affected where you lived, where you worked, where you slept, where you studied, where you ate, who you married, and even who you were friends with. However, opposition to the system, both North and South, was starting to surface. The experience of the war and the mass migration from the rural to urban industrial areas created a new confidence. So began the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. Rosa Parks was the figurehead who famously refused to stand up and was arrested for her troubles. This act that started the year-long boycott of public transport system wasn't a spontaneous act, as it's often depicted. Parks was a long-standing activist who had spent time in the communist movement in the 30s and with left-wing radicals at the Highlander Folk School. She said, "I had a lifetime of being rebellious about being mistreated because of my colour." She was so brave, like many forgotten men, but more women who risked violence, rape, and the loss of their own and their families' lives to bring much needed change. I'm not arguing men were braver than women. What I'm arguing is a lot of the amazing struggles that women went through aren't really recorded or talked about as much in history. But it was a 26-year-old preacher, Martin Luther King, who shot to prominence as a result of the boycott that involved over 40,000 people at its height. As a student, he had studied Gandhi in the Indian independence movement and had been won to the strategy of non-violence resistance. The boycott grew, and so did King's reputation. He appeared on the cover of Time magazine and spoke to the president. As the drama unfolded in the press in front of millions of Americans, the Supreme Court moved to end segregation on the Montgomery buses. This was a massive victory for the movement and a serious blow for the Southern segregationist political elites. King used this advantage to set up the SCLC, which is a bit of a mouthful, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which consisted of young radical ministers throughout southern towns and cities. It's just important quickly to say here that ministers were paid for by the community, so they had a lot more independence than most black people in the community who generally worked for white people, so they had more autonomy. So that's why ministers could speak out and could organise in a way that people that worked for white racist bosses couldn't. The bus boycott spread and people moved on to desegregating schools. King wrote, "Feeling that our demands were moderate, I assumed they would be granted. I had assumed that they would be granted with little question. I had believed that the privileged would give up their privileges on request. This experience, however, taught me a lesson. I came to see that no one gives up his privileges without strong resistance. I saw further that the underlying purpose of segregation was to oppress and exploit the segregated, not simply keep them apart." Once the floodgates had opened and people had tasted victory, there was no closing them. The next target was the lunch counters of Woolworths in Greenboro, North Carolina. And this is really important for socialists and activists in terms of how something can start small and how it can mushroom, because sometimes it's just one of us standing outside somewhere picketing or whatever, and we can feel a bit sad and lonely. So in terms of the Greenboro lunch counter sit-ins, as they called them, on Monday the 1st of February 1960, 4 black students from a local college sat in the whites-only section at the counter. They were not served and they were chucked out at closing time. The next day, 16 turned up. The day after that, 60. And on day 4, 300 moved out to other stores in Greenboro. They called these actions sit-ins, as I mentioned. The sit-ins mushroomed, and within 3 months, 50 cities had 50,000 participants. Again, I think it's quite important to say here, the bravery of these people is incredible. They were stabbed with forks, they were burnt with cigarettes, they were forced to the floor and kicked, their hair was pulled, they were spat on. So for more to keep coming back, just for the right to be able to, as a person of colour, have a cup of coffee and be served a sandwich, is just incredible. I really take my hat off to them, and I hope I'd be as brave in those circumstances. Truly resilient, absolutely awe-inspiring. Next came the freedom rides, cars and buses across the south demanding equal treatment. They were firebombed, beaten, arrested, and sometimes murdered. Unbelievable. So it was illegal even to travel in a car, black and white people to travel together. It was illegal. So obviously people got stopped, and in some famous cases they were killed. And Mississippi Burning is a film about some freedom riders. So again, if I'd advise people they don't know much about it, that's quite a good place to start. Non-violence was a badge of honour for the movement, and they trained hard. As a large, poor and unarmed minority facing down a heavily armed, racist and corrupt state, guns and violence didn't seem a viable option, and non-violence was more attractive to white and liberal middle-class liberal supporters. But there was an increasing problem for some with this strategy. King and the movement relied on Washington and the National Guard for protection from the local police and racist militia. Often Washington didn't respond. The Democratic government under Kennedy didn't want to lose Southern Democratic politicians and voters. This was a massive contradiction. Those that ran the South were a wing of the Democrats called the Dixiecrats, like Bulldog and Connor, who used dogs, who set dogs on school children that were demonstrating. And you can imagine, and the rumour is that he starved the dogs so they'd be more vicious. So it's just horrific, really, people's kids having to confront that. By 1963, many of the movement had grown impatient with the slow pace of change. The March on Washington in August 28th brought 250,000 people to the streets of the capital demanding jobs and freedom, but little had changed for most black people. There are many books and films again about the March on Washington, which is seen as the high point of the struggle, but actually it was kind of in the middle of the struggle, and there were lots of debates around it. Malcolm X came to Washington, but he called it the farce on Washington, and he refused to go to the march. Again, if people want to discuss that in the questions and contributions, then by all means, but I'm not going to go into that in any details. The main gains from Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy after he was assassinated, voter registration and the desegregation of schools. The violence, the bravery that people suffered was incredible, but there was also a horrible reaction after it. Civil Rights Bill was an amazing victory and a massive concession from the ruling class, but it was too little, too slowly, and wasn't being enforced by the National Guard. So the politicians and police who ran the South and were vehement segregationists continued with business as usual. Many in the movement felt too little progress had been achieved, while the Kennedy administration hoped this was the end of the movement. The ranks of the movement were now swelled with young radical activists and students. One of the main groups that sprung out of this were called SNCC, SNCC, which stood for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And also just to sort of get a sense of the scale of it, in 1963 there were 758 demonstrations in 86 cities with over nearly 15,000 arrests just between June and August of that year. Freedom now was the new chant, and King no longer seemed to be, to these young activists, as the person to lead the new, more militant phase of the movement. King was also sick of the slowness of progress and the horrific violence that continued to be unleashed. Once quite conservative pastors, preachers, had many in their ranks who, along with the SNCC, now actually saw and understood the need of armed self-defence for their communities that were just suffering from horrific, unmentionable violence. I'll give you an example. People don't realise, but this is 3 weeks after the March on Washington that's seen as the high point of the struggle. So less than 3 weeks later, Sorry, wrong page. Apologies. Less than 3 weeks later, on Sunday the 15th of September 1963, at 11:22 a.m, a deafening bang could be heard all over the city. A bomb outside the 16th Street Baptist Church had blasted a 7-foot wide hole through a brick wall, behind which was a Sunday school class. Adi Mae Collins, 14, was tying the sash of her friend Denise McNair, 11. Carol Robinson and Cynthia Wesley, both 14, were doing their hair. After the smoke cleared and the heavy rubble lifted away, 4 child bodies were found. One was decapitated, and their identities could only be established through their shoes and jewellery. More than 20 other churchgoers were injured in the blast. So really, this is the reaction. There have been some concessions, but black people still lived in horrific conditions, and this is what they were having to deal with. So it was horrific. And again, there's a brilliant film by Spike Lee about the 4 little girls, and there's lots written about that. At this point, obviously, the movement was still knew they had a long way to go, and they turned their attentions to Selma, Alabama, and voter registration. Again, there were a series of 3 demonstrations that happened in Selma. I haven't really got time to go into them now. Maybe people can talk about them in the discussion. Martin Luther King understood why the struggle must be moved to the north at this point, where people suffered, even though there wasn't legalised segregation. Then, under Jim Crow, black people still suffered the worst housing, jobs, education, and suffered the same police brutality. If you were a black American, far from being the American dream that is depicted in many Hollywood films, life was pretty horrible in every way, and you had very little control. So although the northern establishments didn't rely on segregation, they were not prepared to rock the boat either. In 1966, King went to Chicago to make quite radical demands on city authorities, including a major redistribution of wealth. Much of the liberal media and northern supporters turned against him. The campaign stalled with little to show for it. So what you've got to realise that a few years before, Martin Luther King had won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he'd also been named Time Magazine's Man of the Year. So he had been sort of accepted by the establishment and the mainstream press. So this is what happened when he went to Chicago. In all the speaking that I've done in the United States before varied audiences, including some hostile whites, the only time I have been booed was one night in a Chicago mass meeting by some young members of the Black Power movement. I had urged them to have faith in America and in white society. Their hopes had soared. They were now booing because they felt we were unable to deliver on their promises. So by this point, by 65, it's 10 years on since the Montgomery bus boycotts, and very little had changed for ordinary black people. At this point, King really questioned himself and his hopes for the movement. In the past, he had criticised the anger that sometimes exploded into violence. Now he defended it. So in terms of the rebellions against police brutality that sometimes erupted in the past, he'd been very critical. But very quickly now, he was re-strategizing how we take the movement forward and how you could get change. These are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression, and out of the wombs of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. The shirtless and barefoot people of the earth are rising up as never before. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. We in the West must support these revolutions. Communism is a judgment on our failure to make democracy real and to follow through on the revolutions that we initiated. So he said that in 1968. He was also now very critical of the war in Vietnam, which was an extremely unpopular stance to take at that time. In 1968, to the disgust of many of his former allies, including people in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Malcolm X turned his attention to sanitation workers' strike that was happening in Memphis, Tennessee. It happened because in February, 2 sanitation workers died because of issues around health and safety. It was a workforce of exclusively black workers, over 1,000 black workers, and they'd gone on strike. Martin Luther King saw a possibility for renewing his Poor People's Campaign that he tried to establish a few years before. So, right, so it's 22. King addressed this is a sanitation workers' strike. King addressed them and their supporters in one of the largest indoor mass rallies of the civil rights era. He celebrated their resistance, saying, "You are reminding not only Memphis, but you are reminding the nation that it is a crime for people to live in this rich nation and receive starvation wages. And I need not remind you that this is our plight as a people all over America. The best way for workers to fight poverty," King said, "is a union. Don't go back on the job until the demands are met. Never forget that freedom is not something that is voluntarily given by the oppressor. It's something that must be demanded by the oppressed." He went on to argue for general shutdown of the whole of Memphis, but not that surprising that the American government was really getting very concerned about the influence he had on the movement, and they made it priority to destroy him. And far from being the opposite of Malcolm X, who had been assassinated in 1965, they were both far more similar than history paints them. By the end of their lives, both understood that racism was intrinsically linked to capitalism, and that one of its main weapons to divide and rule those that produce the wealth of society and sell their, is one of their main weapons they use to divide and rule those that produce the wealth of society and sell their labour, us, the workers. We must recognise that we can't solve our problem now until there is a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. The whole structure of American life must be changed. America is a hypocritical nation, and we must put our own house in order. By bringing together his open opposition to the war, the fight against racism and the battle to end poverty, showed that he was now against the whole system of capitalism. He was now vilified by the press and many liberals who had previously cheered him on in his struggles to end segregation in the South. He was called a communist and a Marxist, and was called the most dangerous Negro in America by William Sullivan, who was a senior staffer in the FBI. He did return to Memphis, and in his last major speech, he said, when he addressed the strikers, he came to a mass meeting, and midway through his speech, to the consternation of his audience and staff, King broke off and started speaking to himself in the past tense, saying, "Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind like anybody. I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to go to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land." The next day, at 6:08, on the balcony of the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, King was shot and killed by a white racist, James L. Rain. Brutal murder didn't dissipate the anger and the determination to end racism and inequality, but took it to a new level. The rest of 1968 saw the biggest civil unrest in the US since the Civil War 100 years before. Black power and black electoralism were the next phases of the struggle. I think there's a lot I could say now how we got from there to Obama, but I think at this point I'm going to leave it open for discussion and see what you all have to say. Thank you.
Wow, thanks, Nick. Great talk and a powerful speech from Martin Luther King to end on, really, and very prophetic. I actually went to America last year, and I went to the Lorraine Motel. I saw a bit of that history there, but I won't go into that in detail. But yeah, there's various theories about what happened to him at the end. But anyway, I'll open it up for discussion, questions, contributions. It doesn't have to be a long one. Anybody want to start? Put your hand, pardon me, put your hand up and use the raise hand thing. That's it. I've got, oh, somebody did and then they didn't. Sorry, I'm technologically challenged. No, I haven't got anybody. Oh, okay. I've got Dave Allen first, yeah. Do you want to unmute yourself?
I can't. Oh, there we are.
There you go.
A bit of difficulty there. Yes. Sorry, I missed the first part of this because Zoom wasn't letting me in, but I'm here now. Something that you said towards the end about when King went to Chicago and started arguing about the situation of the black people in the North, and how the liberal wing of his support started to pull away because they believed he was getting involved in class politics, I suppose. And it sounds very similar to what's happening with the Black Lives Movement in the UK, where they put out this statement about capitalism and being the root of racism and the need to break with capitalism to actually overthrow racism. And it's just so similar, the same reaction that King got after, what, 10 plus years of campaigning. BLM UK is getting the same reaction within a matter of months, not even 10 weeks. So, you know, we see the same thing, history repeating itself, as it were. But there you go, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Dave. I should have said right at the start, if you don't feel confident or you maybe can't say what you want to say with a contribution, feel free to use the chat to ask questions or respond to what people are saying, even if you don't want to actually make a contribution.
I come in very quickly, Andy, just to promote this book. It's a book published by Bookmarks, Martin Luther King. It's a very short book. Can you see it there on the screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
If anybody's interested in that, or Malcolm X, same kind of thing, they're £2 or £3. So message me and I'll make sure you get one. Cheers.
Yeah. The one on Martin Luther King from Yuri Prasad wrote it. Very good, very good. I've got Mike next.
You
Do
hear
you want to
me?
unmute yourself, Mike?
You hear me? Can you
Bit
hear me?
quiet. You're a bit quiet.
Okay, I'll turn up a bit. Can you hear me now?
A little bit better, yeah.
I won't shout. Hear me now, all right?
Just about.
Blimey. It's not my end, is it, Andy? Oh, okay.
Keep going anyway.
You can hear me. Oh, you're pretty loud. Okay. Right, might be long. Right, say about Martin Luther King, right? Non-violence. There's a lot of connotations, but the ruling class, they always cite Martin Luther King to delegitimize militant protests. But King was not a proponent of passive compliant protest. When ruling elites call for peace, they are demanding our docility. And while the state commits acts of brutality on us, on existing protests, the state uses the rhetoric of non-violence to discipline protesters and shift responsibility of state violence onto its victims. For King, non-violence was not about playing by the rules or being non-threatening. Effective non-violence is about collective action to disrupt the workings of a repressive society. King knew this, and while he rejected rioting as a tactic, he defended rioters themselves as expressing justified anger and rage against a system that's brutalized, exploited, and abandoned them. King thought that direct action, militantly pursued, was a more promising path for confronting the American state. For King's vision of mass civil disobedience, he looked at the labor movement. In 1966, he cited the strike by 35,000 airline workers as an example of non-violent power in action. King's Poor People's Campaign in the 60s was a similar program of non-violent coercion to force the state's hand in pursuit of change in American society. This pandemic has created the opening for a non-violent insurgency. 10 years of austerity, unemployment, insecure low-paid jobs has made it possible to forge collective rage into multiracial solidarity for massive civil disobedience. Elites are desperate to delegitimize this anger by invoking King and the myth of non-violence. Holding anger without violence means using anger to energize collective resistance without being consumed by it. The challenge posed by King's vision of mass civil disobedience is how we convert that anger and outrage into power. The peace that non-violent struggle aims for isn't found by accommodating ourselves to the status quo or playing by their rules. It can only be won in the struggle against the evils of capitalism, racism and militarism, the foundation of the rule of violence. That's it, thanks.
So, thanks, Mick. I've got Thomas next.
Yep,
Go on,
hello.
you. Okay.
So the criticism of the BLM movement is that, you know, they're Marxists, and this is coming from a lot of right wingers. I don't know. Do people think the movement is a Marxist movement, or they and stuff like that? And you know, I might not be the best person to answer this. What is Marxism? Yeah.
Right, thanks, Thomas, for that. I haven't got anybody else who's indicated to speak. Please feel free to use the chat or ask any little question. It doesn't have to be a long one. Mark, unmute yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about revolutionary reform because it seems to be something that goes through history. The Chartists had their divisions between the reformists and the revolutionaries. The civil rights movement had the same sort of thing. They had the same thing in Northern Ireland. You had the more militant sections of the Irish. Connolly was his name, and the more the reformists. So there's like a pattern going through history and stuff like that. I wanted to sort of more interested between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, because obviously Malcolm X came for the most sort of hands-on, violent approach. And he did that speech, "The chickens are coming home to roost," over the Kennedy. And Martin Luther King, like Mick said, wasn't against violence, but he used it as a tool, stuff like that. Martin Luther King sort of came more to the revolutionary side, and Malcolm X seemed to went the other way, sort of towards the end. And they obviously Malcolm X criticised Martin Luther King, but then he started. They sort of appreciated each other in the end in a certain way. You know what I mean? I think Malcolm X sort of tamed in a way, and Martin Luther King became more militant. If you could go on touch on that a bit, does that happen? You know, why did that happen, sort of thing. And I also want to ask the question of the National Association for Coloured People, the Advancement of Coloured People. They believed in education. They believed in that if we could educate all the African Americans in America, then it will be much better. Where did they go? You know, because people now argue what we need to do on the left is we need to educate the workers. They say this. What we need is if we educate the workers, everything's going to be fine. And I think they had that position, the National Association for Coloured People. If we educated all the African people, everything will be fine. Some believe in education, some believe in this light touch reform approach, and obviously we believe in revolution. And it's only, I think that's only through struggle that actually things get achieved, and that seems to be the pattern through history, from the Chartists right up till now. You know, I mean, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Mark. I haven't got anybody else put their hand up. Dave, unmute yourself.
Okay. I wanted to ask, I just wanted to make a point about what Mark just said, maybe, but I think the issue with Martin Luther King we have to remember is that ideas do change in struggle. But what I think made Martin Luther King most dangerous to the establishment was the point when he made a direct alliance with the organised working class and saw the importance of the Memphis garbage dispute as a means of fighting not only for civil rights but also for economic rights, and started to, in his writing, make some clear move towards some clear conclusions about the importance of the working class to achieve, organised workers in achieving social justice in America. And I don't think Malcolm X was moving away from revolutionary ideas. I actually think it was the opposite. Malcolm X started out as a black nationalist who was at best extremely suspicious of alliances with white people, and who, for very good reasons and his own experience, distrusted most white people, but actually saw the collective power. He actually drew Mecca and seeing white people praying with black people in mosques and so on. But he also, I think, started to draw closer to Martin Luther King because he understood the centrality of capitalism in the development of racism and the need to take on capitalism as part of the struggle against racism in America as well. So it's true that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were moving to a form of convergence in their ideas. They didn't agree with each other and everything they said, and neither would define themselves as Marxists. But in practice, their practice was moving towards the kind of actions that would be in alignment with what Marxists would do in the same situations. And so that's why I think Martin Luther King became really dangerous. The only other point I wanted to make was I'd be interested to hear what the speaker or others have got to say about the importance of being careful where people are socialists and are not religious, about being careful in how we approach working with both organised religion and people who are religious, because clearly if people had refused to work with Martin Luther King on those grounds, that would have been disastrous, and we have to be careful we don't make mistakes along those lines today.
Thanks, Dave. Anybody else?
Some of the women need to talk or ask questions. Come on, everyone.
Nikki said some of the women need to talk and ask questions. Yeah, I'm just repeating that in case anybody didn't hear it.
Yeah. Hi, thank you very much, Nikki. Brilliant, really interesting. I don't know quite what to pick out. It was so much more detail, but I'm going to pick on the a bit later on in the struggle. But this, I've kind of picked on the amount of attention that was actually given to segregation and the thoroughness. I mean, when I'm thinking about, you mentioned the, was it the Greenborough Lunch Club? Yeah, lit lunch counter. I mean, that people were stabbed and burnt and their hair pulled and various other injuries and assaults. But that's one thing. And when you mentioned the cars and then the schooling and then the churches, and that you couldn't travel in the same car, you couldn't travel on the same part of the bus, you couldn't eat in the same area of any establishment. Artists couldn't go in the same door as white people. Black artists would have to go in different doors, stay in different hotel accommodation, and so it would go on. What I'm getting from this is as you say, privilege is not given up easily. That much effort has gone into this segregation that there's a lot to be gained from keeping it for capitalists, for racists. So I just think that we need to remember that all those efforts are there to continue our oppression. That's what one of the things I'm getting from your talk. But I'll come back again. Thank you very much, Nikki.
Tricia? Abby, you want to unmute yourself? Okay, far away.
Good evening, everyone.
Yeah.
I just have really just a question, which is, do we think that socialism is on the increase in the UK? And where I'm coming from with that is when I look at the recent US Democratic candidate elections, you had Bernie Sanders, who was representing, the Democratic Socialists, and I'm just wondering, and we saw how that turned out. And if we are trying to sort of replicate a similar model here, we have, I think, do we have a challenge with creating that space for candidates with similar types of ideologies? Is the UK ready for a socialist representation within Parliament? And and if it's not, is it because there's an image problem associated with it?
Thanks, Abby. I suspect other people want to come back on that particular question of representation of the movement. I'll just give people a bit of information. There's two potential formations for political parties that we know about just in the West Midlands. One from Birmingham, being developed by Reverend Desmond Jadu, and he's very active on the Windrush question, and also one of our active people in Stand Up to Racism and Black Lives Matter in Nuneaton, who's also promoting a party called Our Humanity Matters. So those two things are going on, but I suspect other people will have other things to say about, yes, what the Labour Party is doing to represent the massive movement that's developed around Black Lives Matter and what maybe other parties are doing. Tamsin.
I'll probably forget what I'm saying halfway through, as I usually do. But one thing I was going to say was I read a couple of articles lately. One was about Black people in the Czech Republic and whether they felt that they were experiencing racism while living there. And quite a few of them said, yeah, I do, and it's difficult. But notably, there were about as many who were African American who said, actually, I feel a lot safer here. I feel like I can, send my kid up to the shop and they won't get shot by the police, basically. Which I think perhaps, I'm not saying by any means that the Czech Republic is not racist. I know that it is. I've got a friend who was born in the Czech Republic who's of Roma origin who can certainly tell you about the racism there. But I think it gives you an idea more about the level of racism in the US against Black people and how that must feel. There was another article I read. It was just someone's post, actually, I think, one of these that gets shared around Facebook. And it was about someone saying that, UPS had delivered a parcel to their house and it was the wrong address or wrong person. But and the right address was only around the corner, but they were not going to take it round there because there was the risk that the people whose parcel it was might try and kill them. So they'd phone UPS and ask them to pick it up, and that they needed to take it, and that this family was saying, there's no way I'm taking that parcel round the corner. And I think that gives you an indication of, some areas must very much be like that. That's not to say all are, and that's not to say that there's no resistance to that. but I'm saying that that's clearly something that's a very real fear for a large body of people. But I was going to have a really crap attempt at explaining Marxism. You know, it kind of, sometimes it's good to have a crap attempt because, you know, I don't want people to think, you know, I don't want anyone to think that their contribution is not worth making. Okay, so here's why I became interested in Marxism. Is because it's about collective ownership of the means of production. So if we look at, it's also about production for human need. And these are important when you look at things like COVID. So collective ownership of the means of production means we ordinary people, the working class, I know it's a dirty set of words, but it's a very important set of words to us. But we, the working class, you know, in order to change society, we want to take control of the factories, the machines, you know, those instruments that are used to make what ordinary people need, what humans need. And that's important because you look at the situation with COVID, and I work in the NHS, I know what it's like to have crap PPE, personal protective equipment, that's completely inadequate. And, you know, for us as Marxists, it would have been, in a society of our making, you have to excuse me, I've got a bad belly. In the society of our making, it would have been a priority to manufacture what people needed. In other words, the masks, the gowns, the visors, and all these things that we didn't have enough of. And, you know, all these things that caused actually ethnic minority workers like myself to be at greater risk of COVID. You know, and, you know, under our system, we'd produce what people need instead of the, you know, women, I'm sure you know, during the lockdown, you've had the relentless adverts for makeup all the time that, you know, we've been under lockdown, and, you know, part of you thinks, oh, that looks nice. And then part of you thinks, no, I don't need that, you know, and, but that's the point again, you know, those things are advertised at us to make us feel weaker and keep us in a particular social position, when actually we could be making things that people actually need. You know, we need food, we need, you know, there's all sorts of everyday equipment that we don't have enough of. I'm probably rambling a bit now. But yeah, and the other thing was coming back to education. We were talking about this earlier before the meeting started, about giving people the arguments that they need to win arguments outside of these meetings. And that's one of the good things about having these meetings. I forgot what we were actually talking about because I'm quite forgetful at the minute. But it's kind of this argument that, you know, we only need to educate people and we'll get social change. It's called, it's something to do with the Enlightenment. And there's a book by the leader of our organisation called, his name's Alex Kalinikos, and there's a book by him, The Revolutionary Ideas of Karl Marx. I remembered it. It's a little book, but it's really good. And it goes over that argument about education. And I can't actually remember all that he says, but, you know, what we can say is that no matter how much you educate people, you're still going to leave the edifice of capitalism that benefits from racism. The ruling class benefit from racism. And just educating ourselves is not on its own enough. It's always helpful to educate yourself and be educated, but on its own, it's not enough. We're not going to wipe away hundreds of years of you know, slavery, of exploitation of the working class of whatever colour by the ruling class. We're not just going to wipe that away just by educating ourselves. We need a revolutionary change in society to wipe away the awfulness of this society. You know, the slavery, the stoking of racism by the ruling class, because its divisiveness benefits them and enables them to continue to exploit all of us. You know, so we have to do more than educate ourselves. Educating ourselves is a big part of that. We need to learn history from our point of view. We need to learn about the times when people have stuck together and resisted the ruling class and the things they've done. I shared an article recently about William Cuffey, the Black Chartist. You know, that's part of our collective working class history in this country. and you know, shows how we can win change if we stick together. So, you know, we can educate ourselves, but we need to go further as well. That's my point. Thank you.
Tamsin. Pearl, who sat by me, is going to make the next contribution. And then it'll be Thomas and then Richard.
Okay, I couldn't think about what I was going to say before, so I'm just going to make it up on the spot, if you like. Yeah, Martin Luther King was very much a reformist to begin with, but through his experience and through his struggles, he changed from being a reformist to looking at people, masses of people, and also workers as the way of getting change. Malcolm X, belonging to the Nationalist Nation of Islam, he was very much towards, although he was very much towards our side, towards more left than Martin Luther King, and he then became much more socialist in his attitude. So they moved together. And the thing is that it's whether you're Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, or like my son, or you and I, you know, we all change through our struggles, through our experiences. And Hayden has been involved a lot in the Black Lives Matter, taking the knee, and also with stopping HS2. He's very passionate about that. HS2 putting the train lines through ancient forests. And I was speaking to him earlier, and he's very much not involved in organisations. He wants change, but didn't want to be involved in organisations. But what he said was there was an appeal, and he said, I'm sick of this, a group of white men making decisions on the way that our lives are run. And he's talking about the judges, obviously, for this appeal thing. And I said, well, that's the way society is, you know. I said, it's, you know, it's about class as well. You know, these people are actually at the top of society. They're the ones who make the change. I said, you ought to become a lawyer, and then you could change it from inside. He said, no, you can't change it from inside. He says, it's got to be outside. You've got to actually have a revolution. And I thought, oh my God, you know, he's become a revolutionary. He probably won't join the organisation, but his ideas have gradually changed over the last few years, really, because of what's happened, what he's been involved in, you know, fighting the police, fighting against HS2, being involved in Black Lives Matter and various other demonstrations and actions. And that's the way our ideas change. That's the way we can we complete our arguments, if you like, or our vision of the world and the way it should be changed. You know, most people, if you talk to a lot of people these days, they've come on leaps and bounds in terms of their consciousness. You know, what the police do, how they treat black people, how they treat people on demonstrations, black people in posh cars. We've all seen it, haven't we, all the time? You know, people's ideas, they're becoming much more conscious of the way that society works. And it's just a matter of not necessarily getting them to be a member of the organisation, but be around the organisation. You know, it's important for the ideas of the SWP and those on the left, socialists, revolutionary socialists, the ideas to be put out there so that it'll help people form their ideas about how to change society.
Okay, thanks, Phil. 22,000 stop and searches done by the Met Police in May, overwhelming against young black men. Crazy situation. Just trying to get the story up, but maybe it'll come up in a minute. I've got Thomas next. You want to
unmute? Sorry. This idea that, you know, you can just educate people out of anti-racism. I think, yeah, it's a good point to make, but doesn't racism change over decades? I mean, you see pretty much every decade has a new persecuted minority. So they might I don't know, if you're at uni and, you know, you kind of learn about all this stuff, all about, you know, anti-racism, but then a couple of decades down the line, people might know, people like this, they might support a war that the government has gone into. And, you know, that along with that comes a lot of racism usually. So, I mean, yeah, it just kind of supports Marx's idea that, you know, you can raise people's consciousnesses, but, you know, ultimately you need to change the material conditions that create those, you know, ideas and consciousnesses. That's what I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. I've got Richard next.
Hi, Andy. Can you hear me okay? Because my wireless...
Yeah, we can hear you, yeah.
Great, that's why I've not got my video on, people. I'd like to just make an attempt at answering Abby's question about socialist elections and parliament, really. And I think we've got that's the heart of the difference between us and the Labour Party is where we see change coming from. We see social change as coming from below. And whether it be gay rights or equal pay for women, actually both came from movements from below. Actually, the welfare state was really established overwhelmingly as a consequence of radicalisation in the Second World War. But we've had two examples of it now, haven't we? The Black Lives Matter movement has come from below and has shifted loads of people's ideas. And in shifting those ideas, it's made people more aware. So like the arrest of the black athletes, I think that had been hidden a year ago. Now it's not hidden. Now suddenly people are saying, oh, wow, you know, and actually I know these footballers and what we call him, the racing drive, I can't stand racing driving, but that's by the by, it's steering. But I mean, who are saying, you know, taking the knee, Black Lives Matter. You know, I am a football supporter, and I think every racist football supporter is hating it at the moment, aren't they? They're absolutely hating it. Every time they watch it, I think it's fantastic, right? But that's come from the Black Lives Matter movement from below. It hasn't come from Jeremy Corbyn, or it hasn't come from Michael Lammy. It hasn't come from, it's come from the movement that has shifted that. And then the other example, of course, is COVID, where, you know, really, I mean, there's a reason that Britain, America, and it may be now Brazil, have got some of the worst death rates, which is the most neoliberal and anti-state politicians going. But we've all had a little bit of a breather because the National Education Union stopped Boris Johnson forcing every child back to school before the summer. Now, that came from the organisation from below. And actually, Sir Keir Starmer, or as he's nicknamed, Steer Karma, he didn't criticise Johnson until the opinion poll showed that the majority of people no longer trusted the government. Then he thought, right, now this is popular, I can do that now. I can now criticise him, right? But he wasn't leading anywhere, was he? He wasn't leading it. Actually, it was the rank and file pushing the union officials in the NEU to say, we're concerned about going back to work. By the way, not just the trade unionists from below, but actually parents who took their children out and said, I'm not going to have my kids in school. And the difference is, when people talk education, and I thought Tam's doing a really good job, is what the Socialist Workers' Party tried to do. We tried to do two things. We tried to support and where we can lead and come out with the right tactics for every struggle that's going on, right? And I think it was really great that Tam's in, and Andy said, we've got to have a Black Lives Matter demonstration in Coventry, and just went off and did it. I thought it was just fantastic. Just when we're having one, that's it, you know, great. But the other thing we do need to do, we need to educate ourselves, don't we? We have to have our own education, and I view the Socialist Workers' Party as combining both activity and like a working class university. I don't mean to get a degree, but I mean to learn our education about what's going on, right? About what, and people have learned loads at work when I'm arguing with people. Obviously, it's on online meetings like this, but because we're not going into it, but people taking that statue down, my workmates went away and investigated that and suddenly discovered that, hang on, people have been trying for 10 years to get a plaque put on there saying he was a slave. They didn't even know he was a slave merchant. Suddenly their eyes have been opened by the movement. And the worst thing that, to me, my elder, well, both my lads are Corbynista supporters, and if you think Jeremy Corbyn persuaded 350,000 people to join the Labour Party, imagine if instead those 350,000 people had got on the streets every week saying, we want change, we want more money for the NHS, we want to fight racism, that have had a much bigger impact because they've brought more people with them. And really that's the politics that we try to preach, and it's not always popular politics, but actually really to all those of you who are in the party, I'd really like you to think about coming to join us, because actually we need you as much as you need us. And between us, the last few weeks have shown, both in the Education Union and in Black Lives Matter, we can beat this system on both fronts, even after the Tories have just won an election only a few months ago. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, it's the best education that money can't buy, being a revolutionary socialist, and I think the SWP has been a superb education for all of us.
It's not for you, people.
Pearl was able to put up a strong argument against the lecturers when she went to university as a mature student, because the education she had from the party, superb. Sean, you want to unmute yourself?
Okay, thanks. I think Richard's contribution there was spot on, really, and I wanted to say something similar. I want to address it a bit to addressing the question about, is it time for socialism, if you like, that was asked, and also a question that's come out about what exactly we mean by socialism and by Marxism, because one thing we have to remember is that most of the time it's presented that the society that exists today has always been like it is now and always will be, because it's in the interests of ruling class to have us thinking that way. But actually it hasn't always existed in this way. It didn't really exist until sometime towards the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, something like that, right? Where we really had the development of capitalism. I haven't got time to all the previous forms of society that existed, like slavery and feudalism, which had a division between slave and master, or lord and serf, etc. And now you have this. What I can say is that the fundamental characteristic of capitalism, the fundamentalist thing that defines it, is the division between a small number of people who have become an increasingly smaller number with a massive amount of wealth because they own the means of production in society and have a huge impact also because of that on the influence of the prevailing ideas in society. And the much larger, increasingly larger people who actually have to go to work to exist, have to sell their labour to them, right? And that is an essence of Marxism, that kind of division. And what it means is that the prevailing ideas and the state itself tends to be a reflection of the society in which it exists. So in this society, it's a reflection of the ideas of the small and wealthy and powerful elite, And the state always ultimately tries to do it by consent, but when it can't, it will use armed force if necessary, The state can't be just taken over by workers by voting people into power, because real power doesn't lie in Parliament, it lies outside of it. And we've seen that when Martin Luther King sort of said that he realised, that it's not just those in power, they're just not concerned about dividing us. It's about much more than that, It's about where their power lies, and they will not give anything up without, they won't just give it up because you voted out. In 1969, in my life, I remember biggest lesson in that was Salvador Allende in Chile. It was democratic elected, left-wing socialist government, And what did they do? They bided their time. They introduced generals into his government, into his state, and they destroyed it with a coup, supported by the Americans and all the rest of it, My big, the guy who was the convener where I used to work in Ericsson when I was a trade union rep, he's a refugee from Chile who was tortured by that regime, We've seen it here in a smaller sense. The moment you get a left-wing Labour leader like Jeremy Corbyn, the lengths to which they go is just incredible to attack him, But and that's just like, a left-wing leader of the Labour Party who was in power, it would have got worse. But there are two sources of power in society. One is all that power and wealth and their control of the state, of the small number of the elite. But the other is the people who produce all their wealth, and nothing can move in society, you know, unless we help them to do it. And that's why our idea of Marxism, that's why we emphasize the fact that it has to be ordinary people from below who fight back, because the only way we're going to change society and put those people into power is by those people organising themselves, not relying on Jeremy Corbyn or, you know, Steer Karma or all the rest of it, right? So that's why we hold the views that we do. We need a different kind of state. Ultimately, you don't want to see any state with a separate body of armed men. We want power to be distributed democratically towards everybody, you know. But initially, to defeat capitalism and all that they will throw at us, we would need some kind of state, you know. But it would be based on democratic organs of power outside of Parliament, in the workplaces and everywhere else. And that's why, again, we always have to build the action from below. And I just want to say that about a basic idea about what socialism means to us and why it's important to understand the nature of capitalism as a historical entity and how we can really change society. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. I've got Chetna next. Before I ask Chetna to come in, I've just got a question for the speaker, or if anybody else wants to answer. Martin Luther King was seen as the advocate of non-violence. Is that something that we would all support? And I'm thinking particularly in relation to the movement now. Black Lives Matter. Okay, Chetna.
I couldn't hear that. Sorry, Andy.
Okay, I'll ask it again when Chetna's spoken. Okay. Chetna, if you want to unmute, great.
Hi guys, I just wanted to just ask a question really about, like, I mean, you guys probably know by now, like, I'm quite big on education, and, you know, I believe that it does start with educating, and, you know, I've got an 18-year-old son myself, so I want to try and educate him on Black Lives Matter and the movement, and really understanding, you know, all this that's going on and stuff like that. My question is, all these big leaders, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, why is it that we have only got films to watch and books to read? How can we get it into schools so that young people are learning about these great leaders? What is capitalism? What is socialism? What is white supremacy? What is racism? What is, you know, it's such a big topic year on year. And unfortunately, it takes something like what happened to George Floyd to get it into people's minds and young people to start going, oh my God, like, you know, this has happened, we need to fight. But what can we do, should I say, to get it into schools from an earlier age, so that people, as they're growing up, start to have an understanding of what it is? Because I really believe that if that was the case, for the future generation at least, it is really going to start to change, and there's going to, you know, hopefully we'll start to see a massive difference in that. Because I just think at the moment, it's, you know, it's great that, you know, obviously we're raising awareness and we're doing all this and that, but it's, you know, in the future as well, if we don't start educating now, because when I was younger, I didn't have the education, I didn't have a clue about it. It's only when I, you know, I'm Hindu, and it's only when I got with the Black Caribbean man that I started really experiencing full-on racism at its, you know, fullest, and I was like, oh my God, towards me and him. And luckily my son, you know, hasn't experienced any, but it's, you know, I'm trying to educate him, and I want him to really understand and know about these great leaders, and understand that, you know, all these things that we're fighting for, and the things, you know, that like I said, capitalism and Marxism and, you know, all of that. If I asked him now, he wouldn't have a clue. I mean, I barely knew until, you know, recently. So it's, I think, how do we get that into schools? What can we do to kind of, I don't know, maybe, you know, make a change on the curriculum, I guess. Thank you.
Thanks, Chetna. I'm just going to share my screen in a moment. There's two meetings tomorrow on decolonising education. One's organised nationally by Stand Up to Racism, and one is organised locally by the National Education Union, the Teachers Union. So I'll share my screen in a minute while Tony is talking, so people can just get the details of that. And if anybody wants some more precise details, you've got to basically register it in the poster. If anybody's got the details of the Stand Up to Racism one, also they can put it in the chat. So I'll move on to Tony, if you could, please, or Andrea.
Yeah, I'd like to come back on what Chetna's just said, really, because we've talked, haven't we, in quite a few of these meetings about the importance of education, and it's a theme that's been running through. But the problem we've got is who controls education, and it's not teachers. Teachers have, you know, only some control over what goes on. They abuse the rules that they have to work with. They cheat over the what they teach. They fiddle and mess with what is taught, but are fundamentally tied down by the curriculum that the government controls, that the Department for Education controls, that the rulers in society control, just as Sean was talking about. And you know, and in fact, you know, in this country, bizarrely, and we think bonkers, is that actually teachers have very little control over education at all. How it's taught, the way it's taught, the method of its teaching, and as I say, the curriculum, which is nonsense. I mean, in a sane world, teachers would have much of that control, along with the pupils and the parents, but they don't, because society needs to control it. However, as people have also said in tonight's meeting, change comes about from people from the base saying enough's enough, people rising up and saying I've had it. And actually, that's actually what's happening with education in schools as well. You know, the Black Lives Matter and the rise through it and all the activities is making people being forced to confront the problems of the curriculum. Now, for example, I was talking to a couple of people very before the meeting started, that the National Education Union sees that education and the wider things in society are really important. You know, the fight against racism, the fight to support Black Lives Matter is part of all of this, partly because of COVID and the racism that's come out of COVID and the deaths, the increased death rate for the Black population. But what has happened is, so they put on a Zoom meeting with Reverend Jesse Jackson, Diane Abbott, and loads of others. There were thousands of people at the meeting, and at the end of, as part of the meeting, people were asked, would you like to get involved in the union? Would you like to become a union activist? And somewhere between 600 and 800 people said, yes, I'd like to become more involved in the union and become a rep, just from that one meeting. And many of them being Black members. And it's interesting that we're in a union that actually there are very few Black activists in schools, very few Black reps in most of the country. But that's changing. And like I say, I've spent 4 days ringing large numbers of the people that volunteered from this meeting to become more active in the union and become school reps. And one of the major themes that we've been arguing and that they were talking to me about through all of these, and sometimes I was on the phone to an individual for an hour, and they were saying, we've got to change the curriculum. And what we've been saying as a union is get involved. Get a union group, get parents in your school, talk to people and say, the curriculum's got to change. Put pressure on the union, put pressure on your local authority, put pressure on your MAT, your chain, your academy, and say enough's enough and the academy's got to change. The government has got to change its curriculum. And I think, you know, it's starting to happen, but it's exactly what Sean and other people are saying, is people are, you know, it's teachers in schools that are saying enough's enough, we've got to change this. And I think we as all can be part of that. As Andy just said, there's a meeting in Coventry held by the Coventry branch about how they can change the curriculum. And it's open to parents and it's open to everybody, so get involved in that. But I think we've got to march into our schools We've got to say, I want a meeting about the curriculum and how it changes and what's going on and what we want and how it's got to be changed.
Thanks, Tony. I'd like to ask you a question, Tony, or anybody else who can answer it. Who actually decides the curriculum? Because I believe it's the Secretary of State for Education or the Department.
It is. It is. It's all centrally done. It's all centrally written. There's a prescribed document, and there's a national curriculum, and it's controlled. It says what's taught in what year group, how it's taught, the process. Since I first started being a teacher, I actually started the year the national curriculum came in the early 90s. Before that, it was much more open, but they brought in the national curriculum. And of course, it's now controlled by, you know, the government and the companies that run the GCSEs and the curriculum for that, where it's all specified and controlled. And it's and also the companies that print the exam papers, because many of them are privatised now, and own the exam boards, also print the books and the materials that are used in teaching, and so they control it all like that as well. So it's very centrally controlled. It's appalling.
Okay, I've got Dave Allen. I've got Tamsin, still got your hand up. Is that just from previously? If it's not meant to be up, please put it down. So I've got Dave next, please.
Yeah, a couple of things really. One is that I left school at 16, so in order to go to university, I had to do an access course. And actually, on the access course, it was very liberal. It taught you these kinds of things. It taught you about, the history was about the civil rights movement. You learned about Marx in sociology, all this sort of stuff. It's a far better kind of education than I expect kids get at A-levels when they're restricted to just 3 subjects. So the possibility is really there, and it's quite mind-expanding. And a very, you know, it's a part of the educational system that's out with the government control. And the other thing I wanted to say was there's been quite a lot of talk about Marxism tonight, and if you're interested, because a lot of people say Marx wasn't concerned about race, he thought that Europeans colonialising the rest of the world was a good thing. That's actually not true, and I'll put a link up to an article, it's free online, about Marx's thinking on race. It's well worth reading. Cheers.
I remember from Marx is he said that capitalism turned Africa into a warren for the hunting of black skins. I think those are almost the exact words when he's talking about slavery. So that's certainly one thing he said about race. Tamsin, did you want to speak, or is that from previously your hand is up?
Yeah, I know how to put my hand down again.
Everybody is.
I did say about, you know, people have been contributing brilliant things about education, but again, it comes back to the nature of Marxism compared to capitalism. It's been mentioned that education is set centrally by the Secretary of State for Education, and I imagine that has become more entrenched under the current government. I think, you know, as Marxists, we would say that, you know, you should always try to argue for reforms, and that has given us reforms in the past. But ultimately, capitalism, the capitalist powers benefit from the divisions that they can stir up with racism. They will only allow a certain level of changes in the education system. For me, this leads into the difference, as I see it, between Marxism and liberal ideas, or more further to the right, socialist ideas like, you know, the Labour Party. For me, Marxism is about collective self-emancipation. Now, that's different to liberal democratic ideas in crucial ways. In that liberal democratic ideas, the democracy as we have it would argue, will always exclude someone. That's the nature of democracy. So if we look at the position of asylum seekers, refugees, and how they are excluded from all of these ideas of equality and you know, anti-racism that liberal democracy tries to sell us. You know, this idea of liberal democracy that we have seems to involve the voting away of the rights of other people, people who are designated other, as in alien. And, you know, as Marxists, we intend for human rights to extend to everybody. The difference is that under liberal democracy, we are asking for our rights to be recognised. You know, we're campaigning for that, but we're still asking the powerful to grant us certain rights or certain protections against their ruthless exploitation. I think that's probably a better way to see it. They will continue to exploit us, but if we ask them in the right way, they will grant us some protection, some laws to protect us against the worst excesses of their exploitation. So, for example, again, we can look at, you know, in this country, we're given some protections in the workplace, whereas those excluded from Western ideas, bourgeois ideas of equal rights, those people in sweatshops making our jeans, making all the other things that we enjoy, and those people are, you know, excluded from the circle of Western human rights. Marxism, quite the opposite to that, is about organising ourselves for emancipation that will include and bring in those who are excluded from that. And I don't mean, you know, we'll nicely say to them, oh, there, you know, you nice people, you'll get rights. I mean that they will be part of that. They will be with us. Those people that have been labelled as outsiders, there will be no more voting away their rights. They will be participants in emancipation of all human beings. So that, to me, is what is crucially different, and why I'm a Marxist compared to why I, you know, might have chosen some kind of liberalism or Labour Party kind of political position. So yeah, it's about emancipation, and you know, that means, you know, as I said before, if we are in control of the means of production as working class people, we will be producing what people need, and that means everybody. It means without exclusion, I hope. Thank you.
I've got Young Loving Kind of Girl next, if you can unmute.
Sorry, who's next?
Young Loving Kind of Girl.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. I was just going to basically make a comment about the whole education in schools. So I think a lot of it is obviously controlled by government and you know, powers that be that can control the curriculum. But I think if a lot of it is down to if we can do a lot of our research ourselves by, you know, going to protests or reading a lot more about Black history or joining groups like this, we can get the information and the tools, and that way we can, once we've got that, we can equip ourselves ready to challenge educational systems, and also I just feel like they're only going to want to allow us to know so much anyway. So a lot of it is about doing the research ourselves, and that way we can get the resources and bring it to the attention and say, look, this is what we've researched, this is what we have read about, this is what we understand and know. And that way I think it will give us a better stand in regards to challenging services that do want to kind of somewhat keep us in the dark and don't really want to make us aware about things that are actually happening. So I think if we can do a lot of the research ourselves, that way we can channel and challenge places like schools and whatnot in regards to trying for us to get the information that we need and so rightly deserve. So that's it really.
Thank you very much. Nothing against teachers, but the schooling system's about conditioning us to accept the system in which we live, no matter how good the teachers might be. A socialist education is exactly the opposite. It's very emancipating, as I said before, and very powerful. So stick with us, all of you, and if you want to join us, that would be brilliant. I haven't got anybody else wanting to speak now, so if nobody shouts in the next few seconds, I'm going to ask Nikki to come back in.
Right, can I just say something to the people that are fairly new? I just want to say that whatever stage that you feel you're at in your understanding of Marxism, socialist theory, or politics generally, you're very welcome to join us. And the longer you're in, the more you learn. I'm still learning. I'm sure a lot of my other comrades feel that they're still learning. I mean, I just couldn't stand looking at society anymore. And after a long period of reading the Socialist Worker, etc., I noticed it was only the Socialist Workers' Party that I could see that were always out there and always being active, always on the picket lines. They were always in the throes of things. So, you know, that's what made me think, I want to do something. I've got to do something. I can't just sit and argue with the television or just do bits. I've been politically active before, and then I'd stop being politically active. But, you know, everyone's got their own route in. That's what I'm trying to say. And don't feel in any way intimidated because you don't know anything, because we're all here just learning to try to do the right thing. That's what we're all here for. That's all I've got to say, really. Thank you.
And I'm really sorry, I'm going to jump in because somebody earlier reminded me there's an SUTR meeting tomorrow on decolonising education. It's a national one, but I can't remember the time. So if you know the time, speaker, if you can jump in, that'd be really... At 6. Okay, it will be on the national SUTR page. There'll probably be a link to it. Thank you, sorry.
That's a shame, because it's exactly the same time as the local NEU meeting on exactly the same subject. So take your money and take your pick. If somebody's got the details of the National Stand Up to Racism meeting, we can put them on here as well. So we can join in either. I think they're both very good lineups. I'm sorry,
Andy, I sent those details to you by WhatsApp, mate, so you can get them out and share them on the screen. Okay.
Okay, yeah. I've got the sister who spoke before Trisha. You still got your hand up. Do you want to speak again? Up and kind of girl. No, you don't. I don't think, do you? Okay. No, okay. Okay, that's great. Anybody else want to ask a quick question or make a quick point before I ask Nikki to come in? Okay, Nikki, it's over to you then. If you want to try and draw all that together, an awful lot.
Okay, wow. So we've been all around the world and all through history, and people spoke a lot. We haven't spoken that much about the civil rights movement. In a way, meetings are only ever a sort of jumping off point about discussing what we can do to change and improve the world today. So it's been really, really good. And there's been lots about education. And I just want to sort of remind people that I'm going to paraphrase the Marx quote, that the ruling ideas of our society are the ideas of the ruling class. So when you look at the media, when you look at education, they're basically giving us the ideas they want us to have in our heads to keep us in our place. So although it's good we've had a lot of discussion about education and how important education is for young people in terms of shaping their minds and shaping their views, we're never going to... We've got a government that's got a hostile environment. We've got an openly hostile, racist government that is still illegally deporting people from the Windrush generation that built this country and make this country what it is. And then they're in control of education. So they're not going to give us education that gives us confidence and arms us. So when we're taught history about Winston Churchill being a great man. He was a filthy, racist scumbag, you know, that's the reality of Winston Churchill. We're taught about Florence Nightingale. She was a disgusting racist and treated Mary Seacole abysmally. People talked about William Cuffey. He's the most inspiring, amazing person, and really what our movement's about. He was the son of an enslaved person. He was disabled, and he led the first mass working class movement in this country. As if we haven't got all these amazing leaders. If ordinary young black men and women grew up knowing about these people, we'd walk 10 feet tall. All we're told that we're descendants of slaves, and we watch the police kneel on our necks in public and kill us. That doesn't give us confidence. And to be honest, my daughter at the moment, as part of my daughter's school, my daughter goes to a school in Hackney. There's lots of socialist teachers. We've got an amazing Muslim head, and now we've started a black parents group as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is really, really amazing. But everyone in the group was saying, how can we make this school a truly anti-racist school? And the sentiment and the enthusiasm was amazing. But I said to people, in the end, we live in a racist society. So although we've got to fight as much as we can to make this the most anti-racist and progressive school that we can make it, and use the resources to the best of our ability, look what our children are stepping out into. The policing in Hackney is some of the most racist and violent policing in the UK. You know, that's what our black children have to face, mostly our black boys. This study that's just come out about Stop and Search has shown that during COVID in London, the equivalent of 30% of all black boys between the age of, 15 and 25 have been stopped during this lockdown. You know, that doesn't give people confidence, you know, doesn't give people confidence to change the world. So in the end, we have to fight for the best education that we can within schools. But we've got to look at the reality that black kids are more likely to be excluded, that the curriculum is racist, and black teachers are more likely to be disciplined than promoted. So that's not really a platform for us to just hold our only hope in there, but we've still got to keep fighting. As Black Lives Matter movement has started to say, that racism really is needed to keep the division of society going, and that we need to now really look at dismantling racism. So I think that's really key, and the meeting about decolonising the curriculum is really going to be important. Someone asked a question about Black Lives Matter and Marxists. There's always been Marxists who fought racism. If you look throughout history, in the 30s in America, some of the best anti-racist activists were part of the Communist Party, both in the South and in the North. In the 60s, some of the best anti-racist activists were Marxists. Someone called Baynard Rustin, he was a Marxist and he was also gay, and he was the person that organised the March on Washington. So once you start looking at how broken the system is, really, if you read enough and learn enough, the only logical conclusion you can make is that the system needs to be dismantled and eradicated. Someone also talked about the whole issue around, is it the time for socialists now, and maybe we need to represent ourselves better in the media. But I mean, Boris Johnson doesn't represent himself well in the media. It doesn't matter. If you've got the media and if you've got the ruling class on your side, you can be a drunken, used, womanising wife batterer and you still become Prime Minister. No, it's not about our image, it's about they're scared of our ideas. So the key thing for us really is, I think it is a really amazing time for anti-racist activists and socialists, but while we need to turn this into a really long-lasting movement and get everyone that's eyes are open now to be part of our organisation, get them confident, get them educated, get them out there doing meetings and actually really making sure that we build this movement so it lasts and we get rid of this rotten system once and for all. There's always been arguments in every movement, from the suffragettes. Emmeline Pankhurst was a Tory and a racist. Her daughter Sylvia was a socialist and a revolutionary. Every movement that's made change, there's been debates in, and also every change that's happened is because people like us have stood up and fought back. This time, hopefully, we're going to create a movement that's going to get rid of this one system once and for all. And the next time we see each other, we'll be in the Socialist Republic of whatever we decide to call it, George Floyd. But thank you, and keep fighting the fight.